The year 301 AD, the Roman Empire. An emperor issues a decree to control the price of every single thing across his domain. His name was Diocletian, and his edict fixed prices for over 1,400 goods and services, including the price of knowledge itself. Sell above the fixed price, you die. Buy above it, you also die. Refuse to sell at the mandated price, and you die as well. That simple. But there was something Diocletian never saw coming. An irony so perfect that if anyone wrote it as fiction, no one would believe a word of it. He himself, a descendant of slaves with almost no education, was trying to put a price on the very system that had built his entire empire. The edict on maximum prices covered everything, from wheat at 30 denarii per bushel to a lion worth the same amount as a pound of purple silk. 1 lion, 150,000 denarii. 1 pound of Tyrian purple silk, 150,000. Exact same price. I am not making this up. The edict also fixed the price for chicken eggs, bricklayer wages, and army boots. It was detailed to the point where it almost seemed insane. Here is where it gets interesting. A primary teacher earned 50 denarii per student per month, while a rhetoric teacher earned 250, a 5-to-1 gap. 50 denarii bought about 1.5 bushels of wheat. Rome was paying its literacy teachers less than 1 meal's worth. That was not something Diocletian invented. He was just writing down reality, and reality was that Rome never valued every kind of knowledge. The edict accidentally became the clearest evidence that Roman education was designed from the start to serve the privileged, not the majority. So why was it built this way? How did the system end up creating such a huge gap between teachers who taught reading and those who taught speech? And how did a slave's descendant rise to become emperor only to try to control the exact system that had once locked him out from the beginning? Those questions sound unrelated at first, but they are actually threads woven into the same fabric, stretching back over 500 long years. To answer them, we need to go 5 centuries before the edict, to a small city in southern Italy called Tarentum, originally a Greek colony. This story starts with a war, not a school. And what followed that war would completely reshape how Rome understood the true value of knowledge. But first, some context. Before that war, Rome had essentially no formal education system at all. Fathers taught sons. That was the whole thing. The year was 272 BC. Rome conquered Tarentum and accidentally captured something worth far more than gold or land: Greek knowledge. Before that moment, Roman education was comically basic. Fathers taught their sons whatever they needed, and nobody questioned that arrangement. Cato, Rome's most famously conservative politician, taught his own son law, swimming, boxing, and riding, all by himself without a single tutor. He hated Greek influence, but he was among the last of that old model because everything was about to change forever once Tarentum fell to Rome. When Rome took Tarentum, they captured dozens of Greek scholars and turned them into slaves, and that single act changed everything that followed. Among those slaves was a boy named Andronicus, torn from his Greek homeland and sold to the Livius family, one of the most powerful clans in Rome. He got a new name: Livius Andronicus. His job was to teach his owner's children the Greek language, its literature, and its entire body of thought. A man stripped of his freedom became the one who planted knowledge in his captor's children. Irony does not get any sharper or crueler than that. After earning his freedom, Livius Andronicus opened the first Greek-style school ever seen in Rome, teaching methods that Romans had never known. He then did something extraordinary. He translated Homer's Odyssey into Latin, creating the very first literary translation in European history. The Odyssey tells the story of a hero who spends 20 years trying to get home, translated by a man who would never see his own home ever again. Think about that. A slave translating the story of a hero who gets to go home, while knowing he himself would never be granted that same journey. That translation became the standard textbook for Roman children over centuries, meaning a slave had planted the seeds of his conqueror's culture. Horace the poet later put it perfectly: "Conquered Greece, conquered its savage victor through culture alone, winning the war steel never could win. That line says it all. Rome won with swords, Greece won with ideas, and in the end the ideas lasted far longer than any legion or any emperor. After Livius Andronicus, educated Greek slaves became the most popular teachers in Rome, and wealthy families raced to buy the most learned ones. Demand grew so high that educated Greek slaves became luxury goods, priced above top craftsmen and even higher than trained arena gladiators. A single Greek-speaking slave who could teach philosophy and literature could fetch the price of a small house outside the walls of the city. And the more Greek slaves traded hands, the deeper Greek influence spread. The conquerors were slowly being reshaped by their own captives' ideas. Greek learning seeped into every corner of Roman life, and gradually a formal three-tier school system took shape with very clear separations. It borrowed from Greece but carried Roman features, and it had one characteristic that today we would immediately describe as profoundly unfair. Yet at the very same time, that unfair system proved terrifyingly effective, and honestly, that is the single most interesting part of this story. Level 1 was the Ludus, or primary school. Roman children around age 7 began learning reading, writing, and basic arithmetic in simple rooms. But school did not mean a building. Poor teachers taught on street corners, under market roofs, with nothing separating them but a thin curtain. The poet Martial once complained about being woken before dawn by the booming voice of a teacher holding an outdoor class right next to his home. Beatings were the official teaching method. Teachers wielded the ferula, a rod carved from giant fennel, painful enough but not likely to scar. Primary teachers needed no credentials at all. Anyone could declare themselves a teacher, earn 50 denarii per student, and often go unpaid. Meanwhile, wealthy children had private Greek tutors, learned inside quiet villas, and were surrounded by scrolls and writing tools every day. 2 kids born in the same city. One studied behind a curtain in a loud market. The other learned in a silent villa. Same Rome, 2 different worlds. Level 2 was the Grammaticus, or secondary school. It started around age 12 and was open only to families who could afford to pay for more. Grammaticus teachers earned 200 denarii per student, 4 times what primary teachers made, and they held far more respect in society too. Level 3 was the Rhetor, essentially university level. Very few students ever reached it, because only the wealthiest and brightest qualified. This level produced lawyers, politicians, and empire leaders. Rhetors earned 250 denarii per student, 5 times a reading teacher. Who got left out? Women, almost entirely. Roman girls rarely went beyond primary school because most were already being married off in their teens. Slaves were completely barred from education. Here is the irony. Slaves did the teaching for the rich, but slaves themselves could never learn. The word pedagogy comes from the Greek pedagogos, literally the person who walks the child to school, and that person was always an enslaved man. The entire profession of pedagogy, practiced by millions of teachers around the world today, is named after a job that was performed by a slave. In short, Roman education split rich from poor, excluded women, and ran on slave labor. But the uncomfortable truth is that it worked amazingly. It turned out the finest leaders, lawyers, and orators the ancient world ever saw, but the cost was abandoning the vast majority of people fully. One man tried to fix it from the inside. His name was Quintilian, and he became the greatest educator that the Roman Empire had ever produced. Quintilian lived from around 35 to 100 AD, and he made history by becoming the first teacher ever paid by the Roman government. 2,000 years ago, he declared, "Never beat students, teachers must act like parents, and education should start as early in life as possible." He championed public schools over private tutors, insisting that children needed to learn alongside peers and compete in a healthy environment. He wrote the Institutio Oratoria, 12 volumes systematizing everything about teaching, the most important work on education in all antiquity. He was also the first to say that every child learns differently, and a great teacher must be able to adjust their method for each individual. These ideas were so advanced that modern education took roughly 2,000 years before it even began to seriously put any of them into practice. But after Rome collapsed, his masterwork vanished for nearly 600 years. Nobody knew whether any copy of it survived anywhere at all, until 1416, when the scholar Poggio Bracciolini found the only surviving manuscript locked inside a dark cellar of a Swiss monastery. The monks refused to lend the book. So Poggio sat down and copied every word by hand for 54 straight days, page by page, without rest. That handwritten copy became the foundation of the Renaissance education revolution. A book that nearly vanished ended up reshaping all of Europe. Back in ancient Rome, though, the education system, despite all its flaws, achieved the highest literacy rate in the ancient world, 10%. 10% may not sound like much, but in an era when the vast majority of humans could not read a single word, it was a genuine breakthrough. That system ran well for centuries, until the crisis of the 3rd century arrived and started tearing the entire Roman world apart from the inside. The crisis lasted 50 years, from 235 to 284 AD, half a century of unbroken chaos that consumed the whole Roman Empire. Civil wars raged without pause, emperors rose and fell within months, borders were overrun from every direction, and plagues devastated provinces. The denarius lost 90% of its silver through non-stop debasement. Currency became nearly worthless. Inflation spiraled beyond all control. Soldiers refused coins and demanded gold instead. Trade collapsed into barter across many regions. The economy hovered on the edge of total ruin. Education fell apart along with everything else. Teacher salaries lost all real value. Parents could not pay tuition. Good teachers simply walked. Schools emptied. Teachers disappeared. The knowledge that Greek slaves had carefully planted for centuries was now slowly dying from sheer neglect. The three-tier system still existed on paper, but in reality it was crumbling because inflation was devouring everything, including ideas themselves. Then from the middle of this chaos came a man named Diocles. He was born in Dalmatia, the coastal region that today we know as modern-day Croatia. His father may have been a scribe or possibly a freed slave, which means Diocletian himself was very likely a child or grandchild of a slave. He had virtually no formal education beyond basic reading and writing, placing him at Ludus level, the very bottom rung of the Roman system. He joined the army and climbed from common soldier to commander of the Imperial Cavalry Guard, rising on military talent alone, not on education. In 284 AD, Emperor Numerian died under mysterious circumstances, and the army declared Diocles the new emperor of the Roman Empire. He took the name Diocletianus. A descendant of slaves, barely literate, now ruled an empire stretching from the Atlantic all the way to Persia. He created the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire among 4 co-rulers, and simultaneously reformed the military, the bureaucracy, and the tax system. He called himself Jovius, meaning Jupiter on earth, and demanded that every visitor prostrate themselves before a man whose ancestors were slaves. But one thing even Jupiter on Earth could not control was inflation. Prices kept rising no matter what reforms he introduced, nothing seemed to work. So he chose the most extreme option imaginable. He would use the law and the death penalty to force every single price in his empire back down. Late in 301, he issued the Edict on maximum prices, blaming the entire crisis on what he called the bottomless greed of merchants. The edict was carved into stone and placed in every market across the empire, from Egypt to Britain, so that no one could claim not to know it. Diocletian was certain that execution threats and his absolute power would crush inflation and that even the price of knowledge would have to obey. He was wrong. His mistake would prove a law that still holds 2,000 years later. No one, no matter how powerful, can defeat supply and demand. The first cracks appeared almost instantly, and the problems arrived even faster than anyone in the imperial court had imagined was even possible. Merchants refused to sell at the set prices. The reason was obvious. Selling at those prices meant taking a loss, and losses meant death under law. Goods vanished from every marketplace. Shortages became far worse than before the edict existed. The law against scarcity only created more of it. Black markets exploded across every province. Buyers and sellers traded secretly in the shadows, far beyond where any imperial edict could reach. Here is the number. Gold prices surged roughly 250% in denarii terms immediately after the edict was announced to the public, an anti-inflation decree that triggered more inflation. That is the kind of irony only real history can produce. No fiction writer would dare try. The edict ignored regional pricing, transport costs, and seasonal changes. It forced a single price across an empire spanning 3 whole continents. Historian David Potter called it economic insanity, and reality proved him correct in every measurable way during the years that followed the edict. Lactantius, a Christian teacher personally appointed by Diocletian to lecture in Nicomedia, ended up writing the single harshest critique of him. He wrote that Diocletian first caused prices to rise, and then could not fight what he had started, and that blood was spilled over trivial things. Lactantius himself was pure irony. Hired by one emperor, then fired, then left in poverty, then called back to teach the next emperor's own son. Teacher to outcast to teacher again, bouncing between emperors and ruin. His life was a mirror, reflecting the chaos of the entire empire itself. Despite the death penalty, the edict was increasingly ignored everywhere. By 305, it had effectively ceased to matter to anyone at all. On May 1st, 305, Diocletian stepped down, becoming the very first Roman emperor in all of recorded history to abdicate on his own. He retired to a palace in Dalmatia near his birthplace and spent the rest of his days doing something no one expected at all, growing cabbages. Jupiter on Earth, the man who once fixed the price of everything from eggs to teacher wages, ended up caring only about vegetables in his garden. When his former co-ruler Maximian begged him to return, Diocletian refused. Ruling, he said, had finally taught him to value the simple life more. Slave descendant to emperor, death penalty edict to control the price of knowledge, then a vegetable garden. History sometimes writes odd endings. The edict died with him. Prices only truly stabilized in the 310s when Constantine reformed the currency properly instead of forcing prices. The lesson was astonishingly simple. The law cannot defeat supply and demand, not even when the man enforcing it calls himself Jupiter on Earth. The edict failed. Diocletian abdicated. But what happened to the education system he had tried so desperately to control? Did it die with him too? No. Roman education outlived the edict, outlived Diocletian, outlived the crisis, and in the end it even outlived the entire Roman Empire itself. When the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, the Christian Church absorbed classical education and kept the tradition alive in the dark. Monks became the guardians of knowledge. They copied ancient texts inside monastery walls, keeping the flame of learning alive through the night. Outside, barbarian kingdoms rose and fell. Inside monasteries, Virgil, Homer, and Quintilian were still being taught and studied every single day. Quintilian's work was lost for 6 centuries, then found by Poggio, and it became the intellectual foundation of the entire Renaissance revolution. Rome's 3-tier structure, Ludus, Grammaticus, and Rhetor, never truly disappeared. It simply changed its names and kept on going ever since. Ludus became primary school, Grammaticus became secondary school, Rhetor became university. 3 tiers, 2,000 years, structure unchanged. Over 2 billion students around the world today attend a 3-tier system that was born 2,000 years ago in this empire. And so do you. The word pedagogy traces to a slave who walked children to school. The 3 tiers and the idea of not beating students both also came from Rome. This is the greatest irony history has ever written, something no one could have planned or predicted or even imagined if they had tried to do so. That profoundly unfair system, the one that divided rich from poor, barred women, and was built entirely on the backs of enslaved people from day one. That system left behind the longest-lasting legacy of anything Rome ever produced, outlasting the army, the law, the roads, and the empire itself. The most unfair system lasted the longest. That was not an accident, because once knowledge is planted, nothing on this earth can ever stop it. Diocletian, descended from slaves, believed execution could control what knowledge was worth. He tested that belief with an empire, and he lost it. Knowledge is like water. It always finds a path, flowing through a thin market curtain if it must, or through the hands of a slave, if it has to. Through 54 days of hand copying in a pitch-dark monastery dungeon, knowledge finds its way. It always does. That is simply what it does. Not even the death penalty can control the value of knowledge. That was true 2,000 years ago. It remains exactly as true right now, today.